Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud is a comic book about comic books. Scott McCloud is the main character in the book, explaining to you the history of comic books, but also how to read them and understand them. And anyone who brushes comics off to the side as being kids stuff, or thinks that comics is only superheroes beating up bad guys, should definitely read this book. Comics is a medium that contains many different styles, and it's important not to confuse the message with the messenger. Comics as an art form has endless potential, and it's also a very individualistic type of art form in the sense that individual comic makers can really show their own personal life history through a comic book, because comics don't normally require huge teams like a movie would, where you have all these hands pulling. A comic can be drawn and written by one person. So it's a very individualistic form of art, but it can also be collaborative. So the first section just describes what comics is, which is sequential art. Now, Will Eisner, I believe, was the first to try to legitimize comics as an art form to the public, and Scott McCloud expands on the notion that comics is sequential art and goes into a lot more depth, because sequential art could also be applied to moving pictures or animation. Animation is sequential art, one image shown after another on a screen. Understanding comics explains the unique traits that make comics so different from any other medium. It's a purely visual form that you have to piece together panels into puzzle pieces. The way motion is shown in a comic is obviously a lot different than how motion is shown on a film. On a film, you just keep your eyes open and the information's planted into your brain. It makes for compulsive viewing because you don't have to do anything other than keep your eyes open. But for a comic book, the past, present, and future is all around you. Whatever panel you're looking at is the present, but the surrounding panels encompass both the past and the future. And then what happens between one panel and the next requires you to fill in the blanks, like an in-betweener, like an animator. If one panel shows a person's eyes closed, and then the next moment shows the eye open in the following panel, then what happens in between those two panels, the reader has to add in that motion with their imagination. So comics requires a lot of audience participation. It isn't some mindless art form that's just for little kids. It's a lot harder than watching a movie even, because it requires you to read text and then combine those words with the pictures on the page. And of course, not all comics have text. There's some comics that are purely visual. Again, there's an infinite variety of content for all sorts of different audiences and different tastes. So, well, for example, even the differences between Western and Eastern comics in the way the pacing and the stories are told. In the West, there's a tradition of being very goal-oriented, going from point A to point B. So within one page, there could be an entire scene that happens. But in manga, because the stories are often thousands of pages long, the panels will often show various aspects of one single moment. So the emphasis isn't on going from point A to point B. The emphasis is often on the present, of just being there. So time can be stretched out in a comic, unlike film, where it's always continuously going. A comic can show many different angles of any single moment, and you can manipulate time. Another way to manipulate time in comics is with the panels themselves, the space. You see, time and space merge as one in comics. The length of a panel influences our perception of time. Small little panels laid up one after another would appear as quick little moments. But if you took one of those panels and just stretched it out wide, then it'll appear as if you're also stretching out time. So the length of the panel also influences the length of the time. It's a whole bunch of stuff like that in this book that reveals all these little invisible traits that we take for granted from comics. A really good comic maker will guide your eye along the page without you noticing that they're influencing where you're looking. Just the way the bubbles are laid out to make sure it goes with the flow of the reading experience, and then have images laid out in between the bubbles to where it has a very natural flow. It's something that we as readers take for granted. It's really hard to do. And it also goes to show that comics are a lot more sophisticated than just, say, a storyboard. A lot of people are under the impression that comics are essentially the same thing as a storyboard for a film, but that isn't true, because a storyboard for a film, the individual panels are self-contained, as in the reading flow of the panels don't really matter. But in a comic, each page is like its own work of art, and the way the panels are laid out influences the whole reading experience. It's also, the panels are just as much a part of the art as the art is, because it influences our perception of time. Motion is depicted within the panels, but also between the panels, and each panel transitions from one to the next. So in this book, he talks about the different types of panel transitions. I wrote them down. There's moment to moment, action to action, subject to subject, scene to scene, aspect to aspect, and non sequitur. So, as I was mentioning before, in Western comics, at least the more old ones, there was a heavy emphasis on moment to moment and action to action. It's all just going forward. But in manga, there's a tradition of aspect to aspect. So any single moment could be drawn out and shown various aspects of that one moment. Although now there's a lot of cross-fertilization where the distinctions between East and West is becoming more blurred, which is really cool. So comics as a medium has so much potential. Just don't be distracted by the surface. It's the ideas and the content that matters. Just because something's a TV show doesn't make it good or bad. Breaking Bad's a great TV show, but there's other TV shows I don't like. It doesn't say anything about TV shows as a medium, though. You know, people who say you shouldn't read, or you shouldn't watch TV, you need to read a book. But what if that book is 50 Shades of Grey and the TV show is Breaking Bad? I would argue that, at least for me, my time would be better spent watching Breaking Bad than reading a book that I think is garbage. Although I haven't read it, but the premise of the book, 50 Shades of Grey, sounds pretty dumb. Although I thought the premise of Breaking Bad sounded pretty dumb too, and then I ended up liking it. But the point is don't confuse the content for the medium. And with that, I'd highly recommend this book, 10 out of 10. Oh yeah, and there's a link, it's an affiliate link, I have to say that, in the description for you to check out if you want. He also made another book, Making Comics, which expands upon the ideas in this book as it applies to actually producing your own comics, which is also super good.